In this video, we're going to be talking about Cool Air by H.P. Lovecraft.
Cool Air is a short story written by H.P. Lovecraft. It was published in 1928, in a magazine called Tales of Magic and Mystery. The story is about a writer in the city of New York, who is trying to find a rental that is inexpensive, which he manages to secure on West 14th Street. One night he finds that something is dripping through the ceiling, and he starts to recognize the smell of ammonia. This is the moment that begins the writer's experience with Dr. Munoz, the man who lives above him. Dr. Munoz seems respectable, but there's something strange about him, considering that he's insistent about keeping his room cold. One day when the doctor's air conditioner breaks, a commotion erupts because of his sudden erratic behavior. Later, when they find that he has died, they discover a note that tells them a bit of information that is very hard to believe.
Cool Air mixes the concept of warfare with our fear of death to introduce one of mankind's most pressing obsessions, the quest for immortality. And it does not fail in providing the outcome. Dr. Munoz has declared himself a sworn enemy of death and has devoted a lifetime of bizarre experimentation to its bafflement and extirpation. As we learn this information, the doctor is tending to his patient, who has suffered a heart attack. He is striving to save a life. He is fighting death. But even as he does so, death is fighting back. The doctor's voice is oddly hollow and timbreless, and we know the reason why. It's because the doctor is living in a state that is unnatural, and death is not having it. Death is fighting to claim his due. But the doctor is obsessed with defeating his grim enemy. He's made breakthroughs and advancements against the threat of death that no one else could ever boast, which sparks in him the hubris to laugh at the notion of a proper burial. But his laugh is sepulchral because his throat is rotting, his facial expressions are livid, and to look at him is disconcerting and even gruesome, even as that ancient enemy seized him. When the air conditioner breaks, he grows mad with rage because he realizes the bitter truth. His attempts to stay alive are in vain. The people who witness the doctor's downfall are horrified to see how unnatural it all seems, how truly disgusting the end is for him. This is death's statement for those in their quest for immortality, that the more you try to fight death, the uglier it will get. The great illness of 18 years before more than likely refers to the last outbreak of yellow fever in America in 1905. The health problems of Dr. Munoz originated with this outbreak, and it was the cause of death for the aged Dr. Torres of Valencia. These are the details that explains the doctor's quest for immortality. When we think of epidemics, we think of lives that have been taken unfairly, and it makes us angry. We feel like death isn't playing fair, and it's for people like Dr. Munoz to try and show that death will not have the final word. The quandary arises when we consider those who want to live forever just for the sake of it. Some want to preserve their beauty, others because they want to cheat death, and others simply because they're curious. As people like Dr. Munoz pursue the noble task of preserving life in the face of terminal illness, the other groups gate crash the process for their own ends, and the quandary becomes an ethical one.
Is immortality unethical? Some people believe that it is. They believe that it will widen the divide between rich and poor, that it will cause overcrowding, that the old will outnumber the young, and that mental health problems will be exacerbated. And they believe that immortality without a task suited to immortality is meaningless. By contrast, other people believe that immortality is acceptable. In fact, they believe it is an ethical duty. They believe that it would be a letdown to our species if we didn't seek immortality, and that it is a mere extension of our scientific pursuits. Some people believe it's perfectly moral since many religions offer the same ideas about living forever. And others believe that the right to become immortal is an entirely arbitrary decision.
Cool air serves good purpose here for showing us what we can expect the more we flirt with immortality. We can't escape the dimension of metaphysics when we think about cool air. If we were to accept the story as a work of non-fiction, then we would know by the end of the story that Dr. Munoz has defied death for 18 years. The question we would have to ask is, how did he do it? We don't really get an explanation, apart from knowing that the doctor had spent a lifetime in conducting unusual experiments, that he had a collection of ancient books, and that he did not scorn the incantations of the medievalist. And we know at the surface level, Dr. Munoz is a man who is obviously conscious. He's able to move his body around, and yet his heart is not pumping blood to the brain or body. The metaphysics come into play when we find that the doctor's rhetoric combines the aspect of will and consciousness with the notion of scientific enhancement. The topic is loaded because will and consciousness are prominently identified with our understanding of what we believe to be the human soul. Is there room for science when we're thinking about the human soul? The topic goes even deeper when we are presented with the idea that certain kinds of chanting can trigger psychological effects, which can, in turn, animate human life. We're left to ask, is there something supernatural about these incantations? Or is it the spectrum of vibrational range that the incantations have tapped into, which brings life to the inanimate body? The source material is too sparse for us to venture much further, but one thing we do learn is that the quest for immortality is something like trying to create perpetual motion, which we know cannot be achieved. The power to harness will and consciousness, or the concept of vibrational energy, neither are enough to preserve the actual quality of flesh itself. And so it is that we're reminded that death will always have the last word. One of the marvels of cool air is in how we experience the horror as it unfolds. The technique occurs in a way that follows on something of a red herring. Our first visual conception of Dr. Munoz is entirely direct. It is a straightforward description that paints him as a relatively ordinary-looking man in his later years. Nearly everything else is indirect. Observations and reactions by the other characters from which we're forced to make inferences. The narrator, for example, senses a repugnance about Dr. Munoz and takes note of his bloodless-looking hands. The doctor loses ground physically, and his face becomes livid, and the landlady crosses herself when she sees him. She no longer allows her son to go near him, and the electrician, who is a veteran of the Great War, is perfectly frightened by the doctor. When the air conditioner breaks, the neighbors fall to praying because of the smell they appear to recognize. And this forces us to ask, what kind of smell is it? And why does the doctor smell that way? And remember the transient from the street who was hired to bring the doctor ice, he is spotted fleeing the scene, mad-eyed and screaming. And finally, we have the trail of the doctor himself, which is found, leading to the couch where he has ended unutterably. Where we had a direct description of the doctor as a fairly normal human being, everything about his gruesome demise is left solely to the imagination. There are countless stories in which the writer of said story has written about a writer, but you're not going to see much of that in historic fiction. And it should be noted that there is a difference between a character who has written down a story and a character who is a practicing writer. What we know is that H.P. Lovecraft was in New York from 1924 to 1926, so it's fitting that he has depicted the character of a writer because it offers the prospect of achieving great verisimilitude. It's natural for a writer to become self-referential, but in this case, it would seem as though Lovecraft pioneered the idea. And lo and behold, the modern age is now filled with stories in which a writer has written about a writer. For someone who created the entire genre of cosmic horror, we can now establish him as the founder of this trend as well. It seems odd to think of an air conditioner as an absorption system of ammonia cooling, the gasoline engine of whose pumps were often heard throughout the building. In fact, the term air conditioner isn't even used in the story. Back in the 1920s, they were a relatively new and innovative technology. They were initially developed for use in commercial and industrial settings, such as factories, theaters, and department stores, where they were used to control the temperature and humidity to create a more comfortable environment for workers and customers. In those days, air conditioners were large and expensive, and they required lots of electricity. But in spite of these challenges, the use of air conditioning began to spread to other settings, including homes and offices. As the technology improved and cost decreased, air conditioners were becoming more widely available and were being seen as a luxury item rather than just a necessity for certain industries. For the poor Dr. Munoz, it would seem that his efforts to prolong life were hinged on the difference between a clunky old gas-powered machine and the advent of the modern wall-mounted air conditioning unit. Of course, the doctor could have solved his problem by simply moving into the chilled confines of the local morgue, but I guess that's fodder for another story.